Why did Russian President Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine? What's going on in his mind? Does he see himself as the new Tsar? What is his end objective? What would he think 1 week into this invasion? Are things going as per his plan? And most importantly, how serious is that nuclear threat? These are questions that are swirling in the minds of virtually everyone who's watching us on TV or online at this moment. And there are no clear answers, but the one man who could provide some sharp insights into the way Putin's mind works is Stephen Lee Myers. He is the author of one of the most high-profile biographies of Vladimir Putin, The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. He's the current New York Times Beijing bureau chief. He's in exile, so joins us from Seoul. He's not in exile, he's not allowed to report from Beijing, so which is why he's in Seoul. So bureau chief in exile, as it were. And Stephen Lee Myers, fantastic having you with us on this broadcast, and thank you so much for your time.
I'm glad to be here.
Stephen's worked with the New York Times for 26 years. 7 of them were in Russia. That's the time when President Putin was consolidating his power. He's also written this book, and I want to ask you whether you think that the invasion of Ukraine would lead to the title of your book potentially changing at some point in time in the future. The New Tsar, The Rise, Reign and Fall of Vladimir Putin. Mr. Myers, welcome.
Thank you. It's a great question, and it's hard to predict the future, of course, but Vladimir Putin has shown an amazing resilience and power over now 22 years. And there have been times before where people have looked, whether it was mass protest in Moscow or the invasion of Crimea in 2014, and said, how can this man survive? And yet here we are today. So I think it's premature yet to call for the fall of Putin.
Okay, let's use all the wealth of experience you have, all the research that you've done on Vladimir Putin to try and get you to explain why President Putin did what he did at this time. Why did he, in 2022, at a time when his actions are generating so much global flack and sanctions and pain for the Russian economy, why did the new Tsar order the Russian army to go into Ukraine?
You know, I think, first of all, it was an enormous shock to everyone. I think it was that the American government was telegraphing this through the intelligence they were releasing, but I don't think anybody believed that Putin would launch a military offensive on the scale that he has. And that includes China, one of his close allies. He had just met Xi Jinping in Beijing for the Olympics. I was there then. And, you know, I think that people feel like this came out of nowhere, when in fact, Putin's obsession with Ukraine is long-standing. It even predates his time in power. You know, he honeymooned in Ukraine. He drove around the country when he was a young man in university. And, you know, he had an affinity for the place that, you know, dates back decades now. And I think that part of it is that this notion that Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, they were all part of this fraternal nation, the Soviet Union. And in Putin's mind, you know, that should never have broken up. And it did. He accepted that. He joined the democratically elected governor of St. Petersburg. He rose through the ranks of a democratic Russia. But I think all along he looked back with longing at the idea that, you know, Ukraine and Belarus were essential parts of the same country. They shouldn't be splintered into separate republics as they were after the Soviet Union collapsed.
How do you think Mr. Putin would view the progress of this war a week from the time it started? On the outside, it seems, in the manner in which he mobilized the Russian army, he was probably expecting another Crimea, that the Ukrainian people, government and army would just roll over. He'd establish Russian army supremacy over Ukraine. That didn't happen. So how would Putin's mind be working, in your view, at this moment?
You know, it's an interesting question whether or not Putin intended to invade on the scale that he did say, a month ago. There are definitely signs that he hoped that this show of force at the borders, would intimidate the Ukrainian government and force some kind of political resolution, close to his aims. When that didn't happen, you saw the tensions rise. And some will argue that he always intended to move, and because he assembled the force that he did. This is an invasion force, and I think that what's surprising about it, and I think what he underestimated, was the resilience, the tenacity, the willingness of the Ukrainian people and the army there to fight. And I think that, the Crimea annexation was a special operation. It was done furtively. It was almost bloodless, by the way. And Crimea holds a special place both in Putin's heart, but also for Russians. But to move across all of Ukraine, to send hundreds of thousands of troops in essentially a war of conquest, I don't think he anticipated the consequences of that, both on the battlefield, but also diplomatically.
Your book is full of rich anecdotes about the rise of Vladimir Putin. And since many may not have read your book, I want to take you back to the start and get you to explain what is it about Vladimir Putin's childhood in Leningrad, that's now St. Petersburg, that has cast such a deep impact on his mind, which brings out some of the anger, the frustration, the irritation with the West, which we're seeing manifest itself in this Ukrainian invasion?
I would say there are two important things to understand about him. One is the role of the war, the Great Patriotic War, as it's known, inside Russia. His father was a veteran of that. He was wounded during the siege of Leningrad. That's a searing experience for the entire Soviet Union and all the countries that were affected. And the defeat of Nazi Germany was one of the great accomplishments of Stalin's Soviet Union, whether you like Stalin or not. And I think he grew up with that nostalgia for the unified Soviet effort against Nazis. And it's interesting that he's using that language. He's using the idea that Ukraine has somehow been recaptured by Nazis to justify this attack. The other thing I would say is that he grew up in relative poverty, and I think it was not unusual for his time. I mean, he grew up in the aftermath of the war in St. Petersburg. He did not have luxury. He didn't have his own apartment until he was a grown man, even after he started working for the KGB. And so I think that idea of the poverty and the embarrassment that Russia went through was not in keeping with his vision of the great state that the Russian nation should be. And when he came to office, it seemed like he was more open to the kind of liberal reforms, the democratic and capitalistic, evolution of the country. And, that's happened to a large extent. I mean, he came to office at a time of war and chaos and economic hardship, and he brought stability to a large degree to Russia, and it made him genuinely popular, even as he was tightening the reins on the democratic process, so that it stopped being a democracy at a certain point and basically became, a one-party state or even a one-man state. And I think his desire to recreate the Soviet past that he had, this glorious past of the Soviet Union. I mean, despite his poverty, he felt like he grew up in a kind of comfortable life, something he was proud of. He joined the KGB because he wanted to be an intelligence officer who would help save the world from Nazis. So a lot of this language that you see in him, it's obviously more extreme. It's evolved over the years. But it's stuff that you've seen from the very beginning of his time in office.
You touched upon his time as a young military officer. There's this very interesting story about what happens in Dresden in 1989, towards the end of the East German nation, and how Lieutenant Colonel Putin virtually intimidates people who are really angry and want to attack the KGB residents over there and sends them away just because of how sharp he is. But give our viewers a sense of what is it about that young Putin that saw him emerge through the ranks, take over from Boris Yeltsin, and continue to rule Russia in the decades that he has. What makes him special?
It's important to remember that while he had a military rank, he was an agent of the KGB, not in the uniformed military service. He did wear a uniform sometimes, but I think what was interesting about his time in East Germany, he was there for the fall of the Berlin Wall. He saw the Soviet empire collapse, the Soviet influence over Eastern Europe, and he was forced, like tens of thousands of other Soviet, agents, military officers, back to Russia in this sort of humiliating way. And then 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapses after the failed coup against Gorbachev in '91. That left him basically without a job. And he ended up falling in with the democratic leader of St. Petersburg and became a very loyal assistant to him. And through that experience, I think sometimes by happenstance, he ended up rising into the ranks of the Kremlin administration. He moved to Moscow only in 1996 and really started out at a not very high-ranking job in the administration of the Kremlin, dealing with property. But within 3 years, he was the prime minister. And then Yeltsin, who was under attack, decided that he was a loyal soldier, he was a loyal and competent administrator, and that Yeltsin could trust him to take over the country and, frankly, protect Yeltsin from any kind of consequence for the chaos of his rule, including legal consequences. And then that's what brought Putin to power. And he was sort of almost thrust into this position to be, the leader of this vast country. And I think in the beginning he was not entirely up to it, or at least was less confident about it. But he stepped into the job, and over the last 22 years now, he's clearly searched for a kind of rationale for this greater Russia that he envisions. I don't think he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. I think what he's trying to do is recreate something much older, the old Russian Empire. This notion, it's a nationalistic view of the historic Russian state. Kiev Rus is the foundation of Russia, and
recording stopped.
And he hopes to, in that, find a rationale for his governance, for his leadership over the years. It's become more and more strident over the years. But nonetheless, I think he's found it in this. And he believed that somehow Ukraine, as now an independent nation after the Soviet Union, would tilt towards the European Union or towards NATO, even worse, was somehow an assault on the very Russian state that he leads. And this has been building. This is not new. It's been building for years. I remember going to the first mass protest in Ukraine, and that was in 2004, and it toppled the fraudulent election. Putin took that as a personal affront. He took that as an attack on Russia, and has loathed democratic Ukraine ever since. This is what was called the color revolutions. It began in Ukraine. And he believes that these are being orchestrated by enemies of Russia to split Russia apart, the Russia that should naturally be. And I think that's what's driving all of this. And it's been building. It feels like he just got to a point where he couldn't take it anymore, and he's cracked, and says he's going to resolve this once and for all. And he's doing it in a way that I think has shocked everybody.
In his attacks on Ukraine, President Putin talks constantly of denazification of the Ukrainian government and administrative systems. He talks of getting the country rid of drug addicts. There is a historical context to that. Can you explain it as you see why Putin keeps talking about denazification of Ukraine?
Frankly, I think that's just a distraction. I think that that's a rationale. I mentioned already this notion that he had about the war. Are there neo-Nazis running around Ukraine? Sure, there are in most countries. There are many more in Russia, but they're not running the government of Ukraine. I mean, you look at the government now, and these are not drug-addicted Nazis. So this irrational aspect of his rhetoric around the war really undercuts his point of view, his justification for the war, because you can look at the government in Ukraine and see that they're not what he says they are. And what's interesting is I think a lot of the Russian people know that. I think obviously the Ukrainian people know that. And so the people who do believe this, I think, are a minority. And there are signs, there have been anecdotal cases where even the Russian soldiers don't seem to buy this rationale. And I think that's a real weakness in the strategy of Putin. And I don't know how much of it is fed to him by the intelligence reports he's receiving, by his aides who want to affirm what he already believes, that Ukraine has descended into some sort of fascist state, which is completely the opposite of what's happened in Ukraine. For all of its faults, it's sought to establish a more democratic system. And that, I think, is what really frightens Putin more than Nazism.
There's been so much commentary around President Putin's mental state, especially during the pandemic. The fact that he's isolated himself from all except his closest advisors. When he meets people, he sits on one end of a ridiculously long table, his defense minister, his chief of staff sitting on the other side looking very unhappy, taking orders from him. At least that's what the body language seems to suggest. Give our viewers a sense of what the last 2 years of the pandemic have been like for President Putin. They've been disruptive for citizens across the world, but why is it that Putin is more isolated in Russia today than he's been in the past?
I think that he has genuine concerns about exposure to the coronavirus. And that stems out also, I think, because of his concern that, his departure, in the most extreme sense, would be catastrophic. Russia would fall apart without him in power. And I think, like many people who've been in power too long, he's become increasingly paranoid. They're paranoid of external threats, they're paranoid of internal threats, and now you have a pandemic, which is kind of the ultimate, threat to everybody around the world, as we've seen. And so I think that partly he was just reacting in the sense of wanting to, make sure that he stays healthy. And what's interesting, you mentioned his close aides, is that his close aides are also sitting a long way from him. So you wonder if they're not in the room with him when these decisions are being made, or they're not on the other side of the room, and they're not involved in the intimate sort of kitchen counter discussions that leaders often have with their closest advisors. Who does have his ear, after work late at night? These meetings that he has on television, of course, keep in mind, they're sort of performative. They're carefully choreographed. What you see is what the state wants you to see. There's no spontaneity in them, so everything has a kind of purpose. The dressing down of his foreign intelligence officer, who's somebody who's worked with him for decades, was an extraordinary moment. And you wonder then, again, I think this is why people are saying, is he somehow off his rocker? Because it just seems like an extreme version of that temper that we've seen over the years. And it's led people to ask, has he just been too isolated? We can't from a distance, evaluate his mental health. I think only people close to him, only professionals can do that. But there's no question that he spent less time hearing advice outside of the narrow circle of people who are around him. So he may not be aware of the intensity of the Ukrainian opposition to this invasion, or even just more broadly, of Ukraine's sense of national identity. As much as he wants Ukrainians to be little brothers of Russia, there is a strong component of Ukrainian nationality, not Nazism, not nationalist in a negative way, but just people who want to aspire to have their own country. And you feel that very strongly when you're in Ukraine, and that it's something that I think Russia, not all of Russia, but that Vladimir Putin can't really tolerate. He can't abide by the notion that they would somehow be separate from the Russian state or Russian influence at a minimum.
In 1964, there was a coup against Nikita Khrushchev, and the leaders of the Kremlin got together and stripped him of his powers, and Leonid Brezhnev came in as first secretary. A lot of people watching would wonder, can things reach a pass where the oligarchs, the billionaires, the people around him think this man's gone off his rocker, as you said, and find a way of ousting him? How complete is his grasp on power? Is a coup against Putin possible in your view?
I would say no, to be honest. And, I was reading a historian today who knows much more, of course, than I do. And, the Khrushchev coup is the example that almost proves the rule. There haven't been that many. There was a failed coup against Gorbachev, of course. But for the most part, even Stalin, as brutal as his rule was, people were afraid to rise up against him. And, he died in his sleep or of a stroke, I guess. I think that people hope for this silver bullet somehow. But honestly, I don't see any circumstance inside the elite in Russia where people would be able to do that. The business oligarchs are certainly not part of that equation. The only plausible scenario would be if the security services decided they've had enough. But these are his most loyal supporters. So I would expect Putin to remain in power, even if this goes as badly as it seems to be going with the international opposition and the brutal effects that these sanctions are going to have on the Russian economy.
Putin keeps talking about the use of nuclear power meant as a deterrence. Is this just saber rattling? Or do you think, first nobody expected him to invade Ukraine, but he did. Given that he's done so, now people are wondering, is that just bluff and bluster, or should this man's nuclear threat be taken seriously? And under what circumstances could he go nuclear?
I think he's brandishing the nuclear threat as a way to try to intimidate NATO and the United States to not intervene. I think he worries about an intervention because, frankly, that might be even bigger fight for the Russian military. And, his ultimate trump card is that, Russia remains a nuclear superpower. And as long as they're able to threaten, the cities, major cities of the United States, which, by the way, they discussed on TV last Sunday, how they would strike American cities. I think they feel like as long as they have that, then that gives him the right, or at least the ability, to be able to, exert Russian influence and power over its neighborhood. And they want the United States to stay out and not be part of deciding the fate of Ukraine.
I want to ask you about the relationship of President Putin with Xi Jinping. They're just born a few months apart. They're close on the outside, but a lot is said about what Putin actually thinks of Xi Jinping. One was born on October 7th, 1952, the other on 15 June 1953, only 8 months apart. From what you know, does he trust Xi Jinping? Because he thinks of himself as the great Tsar, and the great Tsar wouldn't think of himself as being any less than great Xi, who thinks he's going to be ruler of the free world.
What's interesting is this relationship is also something that's been building. There was obviously a history of animosity between the Soviet Union and China, dating back to the foundation of the People's Republic of China. But I think that under Putin, even before Xi, but certainly since Xi came to power, has sought an accommodation with China, understanding its value to him in this confrontation that he feels he's that he has with the liberal West, broadly speaking. But mostly it means the United States in his mind. He thinks the U.S. runs Europe and tells them what to do. And so I think he feels like if he has China at his back, literally, that gives him a freer hand. And there's been an enormous amount of trade, which is risen now to 140 billion a year. I think that's been beneficial, especially when Russia faced sanctions after 2014 in Crimea. And, when they came to the Olympics, I mean, you remember, of course, that Biden and a lot of other leaders, boycotted the Olympic ceremony and refused to attend, even if the athletes attended. And Putin was there, to be the leader, to sort of give Xi the appearance of this grand event that he wanted, and in the hours before the opening ceremony, they sat down and met. They put out this extraordinary statement that basically listed the ways they were friends and allies. And that included, for the first time, really explicit Chinese expression of opposition to NATO expansion. They both, and this is not new, but they both expressed opposition to external interference, by which they mean the United States, in promoting colored revolutions. They use the word colored revolutions, which again originated in the former Soviet states at the beginning of Putin's reign. So I think you're seeing a convergence of worldviews and interest between these two leaders. That said, there's a debate going on right now about how much Xi knew. Did Putin actually tell him he was planning to launch this invasion? And, I think that the evidence is still unclear on that. And whatever the case, I think China has been surprised too by the scale of the assault, but also by the unified international reaction against it.
From what you know, how do you think this war will end? So far, President Putin hasn't achieved the military objectives he would have hoped for in the first week. The Ukrainians are fighting hard. They're being armed by the West. Lots of Stinger missiles, lots of Javelin missiles coming in, giving them extra firepower to push the Russian army back. The Russian army has been escalating, but still trying to avoid mass casualties. If you were trying to get into Putin's head, how do you see the escalation spiral from here on, and how do you think this could end?
Well, as somebody who's covered a couple of conflicts, I would caution that you can't really tell in the early days how things are going. Even the initial, progress that a military is making, I think we just have to wait and see. But that said, in the last day or so, the Russian military has begun to gain a little bit more momentum. That's not to say the Ukrainians are still not putting up an incredible fight. The president's been incredibly heroic in leading the people. But, it seems like now Putin's aim is the conquest of at least the government, at least the capital, and some sort of, capitulation by the Ukrainian state. I don't know if that will happen. I wouldn't want to predict. I do believe that even if that were to happen, it would not be a welcome subjugation by the Ukrainian people. They don't want to live under the rule of Putin or some crony that he installs. They wanted to separate from the Soviet Union for the large reason that they didn't want to live under the Soviet state, under a sort of Moscow-centric, Russian-centric political system. And I don't see how that's changed. And I definitely don't see how that's changed when you see the kind of destruction that you have in the last few days, the loss of lives and property. It's staggering. And so I think even if he were to succeed in his military aims, he has an enormous political problem that's going to haunt him, I believe, through the rest of his time in office, however long that is.
Everyone has taken a view on what's happening and why, but you've been able to layer it with a lot of insights into the personality, into the psyche and mind of Vladimir Putin on the back of your research. Stephen Lee Myers, Beijing Bureau Chief of the New York Times, author of the book The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin, for joining us on India Today. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think our viewers would have benefited from your insights as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.